Scary stories for stormy nights. The shape of things. As far as Glenn was concerned, moving into the new housing development built in the foothills outside of town was a great move. He still saw all his old friends at school, and he got to make a lot of new friends, too. The forested hills, the sparkling streams, and green meadows were the best backyard he could have hoped for. And he and Dolph, his 2-year-old German shepherd, spent as much time as they could exploring the unknown countryside. Now, out with Dolph, about to embark on another exploration, Glenn reached the wooden fence that separated the asphalt pavement from a dirt service road leading into the hills. He wriggled through the fence, and Dolph eagerly followed him. Then, once they were safe from any traffic, Glenn took Dolph off the leash. Happy to be free, the dog raced into the tall grass of a nearby field as Glenn sauntered along the road. Only good spider's a dead spider. Glenn had already decided that today he and Dolph would probe deeper into a narrow canyon they had found last weekend. The walls of the hills were so close together and covered so thickly with brush that it looked nearly impossible to enter the small gap. But Glenn had found a narrow trail, almost invisible in the brush, and he wanted to see where it led. Keeping an eye on Dolph to make sure he didn't wander too far, Glenn conjured up images of hidden treasures and old Indian camps tucked away in the sheltered ravine, and completely ignored the possibility of any rattlesnakes, because he had already had lunch and he wasn't really hungry for any chili anyway. But who knew what else he would find here? Why, he might even come across an ancient civilization. The weekend before, Glenn had made sure to carefully memorize the area around the hidden entrance to the ravine, so now he easily found it once again. Whistling for Dolph, "Hey, boy!" to follow him, Glenn snaked his way along the faint path. The hot afternoon sun was filtered by the ravine's leafy branches, but Glenn was still sweating by the time he made it to the end of the canyon. There, the mountain walls opened slightly to form a small box-shaped valley that was covered in thick brush and dotted here and there with gigantic oak trees. A small mound rose at the far end of the hidden hollow. On it was an old building that looked like it might have been a small house at one time. But even from where Glenn stood, he could see the roof was partially caved in, and there were only gaping holes where the windows had once been. "Cool," Glenn whispered. "Maybe it's haunted." Glenn is a friend of Rick's, I reckon. And then, calling Dolph, he started across the valley to explore the abandoned house. Climbing from rock to rock, he made his way up the hill until he was standing right at the front door of the place. Very edgy, Dolph paced back and forth at his side as if he smelled something suspicious. "What is it, boy?" Glenn asked. "Some kind of animal?" Glenn sniffed the air himself. He certainly couldn't smell anything. Taking a step closer, Glenn peered into the dark doorway. He motioned for Dolph to follow, but the shepherd wisely stood where he was and whined. "What?" Glenn asked, a little irritated at his dog's behavior. Still, Dolph swung his head back and forth and refused to come any closer to the gaping doorway. Dogs are pretty smart, you know. Starting to grow worried by Dolph's reaction, Glenn tentatively took another step closer and stared into the small one-room building. He stood as still as a statue, readying himself to run in case some wild animal came rushing out at him. After a long moment, when nothing happened, Glenn let his breath whoosh out. "Come on, you big baby," he said, glancing back at his dog, Dolph. "There's nothing in there." To prove it to himself and to his dog, Glenn stepped through the open doorway. The interior was a mess. Debris from the collapsed roof covered half the floor, which was thick with dirt, and small weeds that sprouted from the moldering pile of masonry. Now Glenn thought he smelled something, too. Some kind of, animal. And he figured that it was what his dog had smelled. Must have been something big, Glenn thought, seeing that Dolph still refused to follow him. Not bothering to enter any further, Glenn turned back to his dog. "You scaredy cat," he said, ruffling Dolph's neck. "I thought you were a dog, not a mouse." Obviously happy that Glenn had come back, Dolph licked him, and the two of them turned away from the hut to explore the rest of the area. But soon Glenn realized that there was not much else of interest, so with Dolph ranging off to one side, he turned back towards the entrance of the canyon. He had not gone far when suddenly he saw a man enter the hidden valley. Stopping in surprise, Glenn quickly stepped behind a tree, and he watched the man as he walked directly to the abandoned ruins that Glenn had just left, and he went inside. Overcome with curiosity, Glenn crept back toward the house. But halfway between the canyon entrance and the doorway to the house, Glenn stopped dead in his tracks. Shaking with fear, he crouched behind a large bush. Coming out of the house now was an animal Glenn had only seen behind bars at the zoo. It was a gray wolf, a very large gray wolf, kind of like the ones wandering around here amidst the spiders. But the house was empty, Glenn's mind insisted. I saw it myself. And then a darker thought shadowed his brain. What happened to the man who went inside? The wolf raised its muzzle and sniffed at the air. Glenn's fear spread through his body. He started at his legs and moved up to a clutch at his chest, making it hard to keep from screaming. His breath came faster and faster, and it was as if his fear was calling to the beast. The wolf turned its head and stared in Glenn's direction. And then it lightly jumped down on the rocks and disappeared in the brush. Glenn sucked in his breath, began to ease backward from his hiding place. Then his nerve broke, and he jumped up and fled. His imagination racing along with him, he could almost hear the bushes snapping behind him and feel the hot breath of the wolf on his legs. And suddenly there was a snarl, followed by a yelp, and the sound of thrashing in the bushes. "Dolph!" Glenn thought, skidding to a halt and looking behind him. But Glenn could see nothing, and all he could hear were the sounds of animals in combat echoing off the high canyon walls. Torn by indecision, Glenn took a few steps back toward the two fighting animals. And with a cry of despair for his dog, he turned and ran out of the valley. Blundering along the path, ignoring the branches that grabbed at him as he pushed along, crying and cursing, Glenn fought his way to the clear land outside of the ravine. Once out, he staggered to a stop and peered back at the valley he had just escaped. "Dolph," he whispered, feeling sick at heart. He waited for a few minutes, then trudged home, making up a story to tell his parents about how Dolph had run away. Glenn felt like such a coward that he just couldn't tell them the truth. Luckily, his tears were very convincing, and his parents sent him to bed early. Glenn spent that night endlessly reliving the events of the afternoon and the guilt he felt for having left his faithful friend behind. But as guilty as Glenn was, he was equally puzzled. Try as he might, Glenn could not explain where that wolf had come from. If the man had brought it with him, Glenn was sure he would have seen it. He was also sure he would have seen something as big as a wolf the first time he looked into the abandoned house, if it had already been inside there. Besides, if the ferocious-looking animal had been in there, Glenn knew it would never let him come so close. Java wants to update. No, shut up, Java. Okay, did that break anything? Why does Java always want to update? There we go. But either of those unlikely scenarios was far more possible than his deepest, darkest thought. That the man and the wolf were actually the same creature. The next morning, however, the impossible suddenly became frighteningly possible when Glenn overheard his dad's morning news program. In local news, the announcer was saying, the body of an unidentified male was found in the Shorthorn foothills this morning by a group of hikers. Apparently, the man died as a result of blood loss from wounds inflicted to his arms and neck. Doctors say the wounds closely resemble those caused by dog bites. All right, Dolph. And are cautioning residents in the area to be on the lookout for any stray dogs that are behaving oddly. Glenn couldn't hear the rest of the broadcast over the roaring in his ears from his own raging thoughts. No, werewolves do not exist, his mind screamed. The announcer just confirmed the man I saw going to the house was just a victim of the wolf, not the wolf itself. Still, even if that were the case, Glenn now had to answer his questions about Dolph. Maybe Dolph was alive and could save him. Maybe Glenn could save him. But how? He was too scared to return to the valley alone. But what if the wolf was still running loose? With no idea of what to do, Glenn decided to go over to his friend Brandon's house. Maybe Brandon would have some good ideas. Oh, geez, now I got another little pop-up thing. Uno momento. Oh, who cares? It's just blathering about something that I don't care about. There we go. We have an understanding. Well, you know. As Glenn approached his friend Brandon's two-story home at the end of the block, Glenn saw Brandon coming up the sidewalk towards him. "Hey, sorry to hear about Dolph," Brandon called as he got closer. Well, that's weird, Glenn thought. I haven't told anyone, not even my parents, really, about Dolph. How did you know about Dolph? Glenn called back. Brandon ignored the question as he walked up to meet Glenn. He had an excited gleam in his eyes. "Did you hear about the guy they found this morning?" "Yeah," Glenn answered. "Sounds like he got attacked by the dog or something." "I know," Brandon went on, the excitement in his eyes turning mischievous. "I'm going up there to have a look around. You want to come along? Maybe we could trap the dog and become heroes." Glenn smiled. His problem was solved. Now he wouldn't have to go into the canyon alone. "Yeah, sure, Brandon," he said casually, feeling a twinge of guilt for not telling Brandon what had happened the day before. Now, Brandon did not seem to have any clear idea of where to go, and Glenn had no problem subtly guiding him toward the canyon entrance. As they walked along the trail, Glenn noticed it was dark and overgrown as before, with no signs of his terrified flight through the bushes yesterday afternoon. "Hey, I wonder where this path goes," Brandon said as he followed Glenn along the trail. I don't know," Glenn lied. "Maybe it's some kind of an animal trail?" As they approached the hidden valley, Glenn looked around cautiously, half expecting the gray wolf to come leaping out at him. He tried not to let Brandon see how scared he was, but by the time they reached the open end of the canyon, even though they hadn't encountered anything more threatening than a patch of poison oak, Glenn was trembling from head to toe. "Hey, look at that!" Brandon exclaimed, too interested in the expedition to notice Glenn's fear. "It's an abandoned house." Glenn glanced up at the ruins, impatient to find the site where he'd heard Dolph and the wolf fighting. Still, he had to pretend to be interested in Brandon's discovery as if he had never been there before. "Yeah, Brandon," he said, trying to sound excited. "I wonder what it's doing there." "Come on," Brandon said, starting forward. "Let's go check it out." Too late to turn back now, Glenn thought, trying to shrug off his fear as he followed his friend. As they neared the house, Glenn angled himself toward where his dog had fought the wolf. Glenn let himself be led to the ruins. "I abandoned him," he wailed in his mind. "Dolph was protecting me, and I ran away like a coward." Though he felt guilty, Glenn was happy that Dolph had gotten away safely, and he realized the dog would make it home before he himself did at this point. See, agreement met. Glenn hardly noticed as Brandon and he reached the dark doorway. Brandon ducked inside first, and Glenn blindly followed. Then, as if a bucket of cold water had been thrown at him, shock snapped Glenn out of his depression. There, standing inside the house, were 5 people, and Brandon was standing with them. All of them, Brandon included, were staring at Glenn with hatred burning in their eyes. What's going on?" Glenn asked him, looking at the boy he thought was his friend. "Brandon," he said, his voice rising in panic. What's going on?" "Your stupid dog killed one of us before he got away," Brandon answered angrily. "What were you doing up here in the first place, you idiot?" I don't know," Glenn stammered. "Dolph and I were just exploring. If I'd known that the man we met were—" But words failed Glenn as he realized he had no idea of any connection between Brandon and these people and the man he had seen yesterday. As Glenn tried to figure out whether or not he should run, Brandon and the others huddled together in a corner of the dilapidated room, obviously deciding Glenn's fate. Finally, the oldest of the group nodded, and Brandon produced a thermos from a pile of rubble. Unscrewing the lid, he took a long swallow. Then he passed it to the young woman next to him. She swallowed and passed it on. This was repeated until the entire group had drunk from the thermos. Brandon then pulled a different thermos from another pile of debris and handed it to Glenn. "Here, Glenn. Drink this." Glenn cautiously took the canister, unscrewed the lid, and sniffed. It smelled faintly sweet, like fruit juice. "What is it?" "We use it to help with our transformations," Brandon said. "Drink some, Glenn. It'll be fun." An evil smile crept on Brandon's face. "Besides, you have no choice, Glenn." Suddenly, Glenn understood. Dolph had killed one of the members of their clan, and now he, Glenn, was going to have to be a replacement for that lost member, whether he wanted to join their band or not. "But I don't know if I... You see, I'm not sure." "Greg!" the others shouted. Seeing that he truly had no choice, Glenn took a sip. "Finish it," Brandon said flatly. "Now, Glenn." And so Glenn drained the thermos to the last drop. There, he said angrily, handed the thermos back to Brandon. Now what? Am I going to grow fangs and start... Oh... But suddenly the room began to spin. What's happening? Glenn mumbled through numb lips as he heard the others chanting in a strange language. To his horror, he saw their bodies melt. They seemed to flow into different shapes, just as his own body was rearranging itself under his skin. And then all at once, Glenn found himself looking at a group of wolves, sitting in a circle around him, panting hungrily as saliva trailed from their open jaws. Am I a wolf, too? Glenn asked himself, quickly looking down at his body. And then he realized that he had made the worst mistake of his life. You don't want me to join you, do you? Glenn whispered to the wolves surrounding him. Yeah, sure we do. Sure we do, kid, answered one wolf, in Brandon's voice. We want you to join us for dinner. Only, I'm the dinner! Glenn finished the sentence for him, his sleek gray fur trembling and a long naked tail twitching, awaiting his fate as a defenseless plump rat trapped by a circle of hungry wolves. Glenn hoped that since Dolph had gotten away, maybe he could too. Run, little Glen rat, run. So that was the shape of things. And no animals were hurt in the presentation of this story. So our next one is called The Good Deed. He just smiled and handed me a Vegemite sandwich. Corey wandered down to the edge of the lake to stare at the water. Behind him, he could hear his two sisters shouting as they chased each other around the campsite. Across the lake, he could see his dad wading thigh-deep in the cold lake water, casting his fishing line out to the still surface. His mom was reading under the shade of a tree not too far from where his father was catching dinner. Corey sighed and flopped down the coarse grass that fringed the shores of the lake. He had always enjoyed coming on these camping trips with his family, but this time something felt different. He felt, kind of bored. After all, why should he be hanging around with his family? He was going to junior high in September. None of the other guys would be caught dead taking a trip with their families anymore. Yeah, Corey said out loud to no one. I'm getting too old for this kind of thing. Realizing that there was nothing he could do about it, Corey got to his feet and set off on a tour of the lake. Maybe he'd find something interesting. He caught his dad's attention, waved his arm in a circle indicating the path around the lake. His dad nodded and waved back. Good, Corey thought. At least he's not going to make me go fishing with him. This was the first time the family had been to this lake, so Corey took his time on the trail that wove along the shore. Fed by a number of small streams from the melting snow and the mountains that surrounded it, the lake lay in a bowl at the base of towering peaks. At various points, clumps of pine trees grew right down to the water's edge, and Corey had to kick his way through a thick carpet of pine needles. Sometimes the trail would disappear altogether, hidden by boulders that had tumbled down from the eroded peaks. Corey tried hard to remain bored with everything, but he had to admit it was kind of fun, scrambling over the warm rocks, trying to sneak up on lizards basking in the sun. At one point, Corey climbed over a large pile of boulders and found himself on the arm of a small sheltered bay. The water was as still as glass there, and he stared at the reflection of sky and mountains that came off of it. Then he picked up a rock and with one swift throw instantly shattered the image. Maybe it'll scare the fish towards Dad, he thought as he descended into the tiny cove that made his way around it. On the opposite side of the lake, Corey found a faint trail leading away from the water. It appeared to follow a narrow brook. Maybe it's some kind of game trail, he muttered to himself. Curious, he decided to follow it. Maybe it leads to an abandoned cabin in the woods with a bunch of werewolves. Or maybe not. But the trail ran deep into the woods, hugging the brook's edge. But after a while, it veered away from the water and zigzagged toward a clearing. On one side of the clearing was a cabin built of dark brown wood that rested on a base of large gray rocks. Corey didn't see anyone around, and glancing at his watch, he decided there wasn't really enough time to check it out. Besides, he reasoned, it's probably private property anyway. Quietly ducking back into the trees, he returned to the lakeside to finish his tour and get back to camp in time for dinner. Maybe he'd come back to explore the cabin before the end of the trip. Hey, you going to do some fishing today? His dad asked him the next morning after breakfast. Corey just shrugged. He hadn't really thought about it, but it seemed like a better choice than doing nothing. Yeah, sure, he answered. Corey fetched his rod and tackle so his dad could get the line ready with its red and white bobber and tiny golden hook. Then the two of them wandered down to the lake. 3 hours later, Corey figured the fish must be laughing their gills off. Corey's dad had caught only one fish, and Corey hadn't caught any. Discouraged, they returned to camp for lunch. Good thing we're not living off what Corey catches, his sister Kirsty teased. Yeah, his other sister Nicole agreed. We'd starve to death. Corey made a face at both of them and took another bite of his sandwich. He thought about the private bay he had found yesterday. They gotta have fish in there, he thought. Oh, yeah, he said to his sisters. Well, I bet I catch some this afternoon. What kind? Goldfish? Kirsty asked sarcastically. Nicole thought it was the funniest thing she'd heard during the whole trip and howled with laughter. Corey ignored his two brat sisters. There's a place I want to try on the other side of the lake, he said to his dad. I'll catch up with you later, okay? Yeah, okay, son, but don't wander off too far and get lost, okay? You can get tricky out here. You could easily lose your way. Corey nodded in agreement, wolfed down the rest of his lunch. Get it? He wolfed down. Anyway, and grabbing his fishing rod. Soon he was back at what he was beginning to think of his cove. He climbed down the rocks to the water's edge and found a comfortable shelf of rock to sit on. He baited his hook and cast his line far out in the middle of the water. Then, letting the line rest on his fingers so he could feel the tug of any hungry fish, Corey closed his eyes and relaxed. Suddenly he heard a large splash and his eyes flew open. Oh, I must have fallen asleep, he thought. Looking at the horizon, he was surprised to see that the sun had already sunk so low it was touching the tops of the peaks to the west. He sat up and he looked toward the water to see what had awakened him. He saw a small inflatable raft floating toward the shore. It was being pushed along on the waves created by someone frantically thrashing in the center of the bay. Seeing that it was a girl, Corey first thought it was one of his sisters. We don't have a boat like that, he quickly told himself, and Kirsty and Nicole know how to swim. That girl looks like she's drowning. Without another thought, Corey kicked off his tennis shoes and dove off the rocks into the water. The cold hit him like a blow to the chest, and he came up gasping. Then, with a burst of energy, he knifed through the water toward the yellow rubber boat. He grabbed her by a rope that hung from its side and pulled it toward the frantic girl. Hang on, he yelled. I'm coming. She didn't seem to hear him over the sound of her own choking breath and kept flailing her arms in the air. Finally, Corey reached her and grabbed one of her arms. Feeling another person nearby, the girl clenched her arm around Corey's neck in a death hold. His breath practically choked off. Corey began to panic as the girl refused to loosen her grip. With no other choice, he punched the girl hard on her shoulder until he managed to jog her loose. Oh, you trying to kill me, too? Corey gasped, reaching for the dinghy and pulling it toward them. Here's the boat. Grab it. Her eyes wide, the terrified girl swung her arm over the edge of the boat and held on with white-knuckled grip. All right, Corey said, breathing heavily while he helped keep the girl's head above the water. Can you climb into the boat? The girl nodded, and with Corey's help, she slid over the side into the small dinghy, followed by her exhausted savior. For what seemed like ages, the two lay in the bottom of the boat, silently gasping. Finally, Corey sat up. Can you help me paddle this thing to shore? The girl took a few more breaths, then nodded. I think so. Corey glanced around. Looks like the oars are gone. Oh well, let's get going. They each took one side of the boat and paddled with their hands until the dinghy slowly slid across the cove to the small trail Corey had seen yesterday. When the boat's tip finally bounced against the shore, Corey thought it was the finest sound he'd ever heard. Quickly, he clambered out of the boat, and the girl followed him. Thank you, she said shyly. You saved my life. She held out her hand. My name's Sadie. Corey shook her hand and introduced himself. Well, I'm just glad you're all right, he said, a little embarrassed. But tell me, how did you fall in? It's not exactly wavy out there. Sadie looked up the trail in the direction of her cabin. I'm here staying with my grandfather. While he was gone today, I decided to take the boat out. I'm not supposed to, she added, biting her lip. You see, I can't swim. For some reason, my grandfather won't teach me. Corey shivered in the cool air of the late afternoon. The sun had finally fallen behind the mountains, and the bay was completely in the shadow. The girl still hadn't answered his question, so he asked again. But I still don't understand why you fell in. I'm not sure either, the girl said, shrugging. I was bending over to look at something on the bottom of the lake, and I don't know, I guess I lost my balance. She stopped for a moment and noticed Corey shivering. You want to come up the cabin? My grandfather should be back by now. You can get warm by our fire. Corey thought about his family around their own fire and hesitated for a moment, knowing he should get back. Then he figured, why not? They'll understand. After all, I'm a hero now. Sadie's kind of pretty. Okay, he told Sadie. I am kind of cold. When they got to the cabin, Sadie's grandfather was indeed home, and he jumped up from the table, and his two soaking kids came through the door. Sadie, what happened to you? He looked at Corey suspiciously. Sadie threw herself into grandfather's arms. Grandpa, she said, her face buried in his sweater. I'm sorry. The old man held her closely while Corey squirmed uncomfortably under the old man's sharp blue eyes. For what, honey? The old man asked, his eyes still fixed on Corey. I know I'm not supposed to, but I took the boat out and it tipped over. She looked at Corey and pointed. He saved me, Grandpa. What? The old man demanded, holding Sadie at arm's length and looking sternly at her. You took the boat in the water? Sadie nodded tearfully. Sorry, Grandpa. I'll never do it again. And you fell in. You see how dangerous it is? Yes. I would have drowned if it hadn't been for Corey. Corey had been watching the old man's face as it showed first surprise, then relief. But now he saw something that looked like fear. Turning abruptly away from Sadie, her grandfather strode over to the window and looked outside. Night had come quickly after the sun disappeared behind the mountains, and the clearing around the cabin was now almost fully dark. Muttering under his breath, the old man began pacing from window to window, yanking them open in order to pull the shutters closed. Bolt the door, he ordered Sadie. Seemingly as mystified as Corey by all this sudden activity, Sadie automatically obeyed. Excuse me, sir, Corey began. What's going on? You foolish boy, the old man said angrily. That was a nixie you snatched her from. A nixie, you hear me? He finished closing the last shutter and turned to face Corey angrily. A what? Asked Corey, completely confused and a little frightened by the old man's behavior. A nixie, Sadie's grandfather repeated, as if that said it all. He made a visible effort to control himself, then explained further. Nixies are ancient beings, as old as the hills, as old as the trees. They live in lakes and ponds. They live in all bodies of water. The old man's voice dropped lower. Nobody knows what they look like because they can change it anything they want. But no matter what shape they choose, they hate humans, and they'll often try to kill them. Corey didn't know whether to laugh at this wild talk or run in fear of the crazy old man. He looked helplessly out at Sadie, who was standing beside the door and watching the whole scene very quietly. Something about her lack of reaction made Corey even more nervous than anything else. Where I come from, the old man continued in a husky voice, it is said to be bad luck to save a drowning person. Fate is offered to that person, to the nixie, who must have at least one human sacrifice per year. But that's crazy, cried Corey. You can't just stand by and let someone drown. Besides, if it hadn't been for me, your granddaughter would be dead. The old man brought up his hands to his face. I know, he said, his voice muffled and strained with emotion. For saving her, I'm grateful. Corey was afraid the old guy was going to burst into tears. He turned towards Sadie. Listen, it's really late. My folks are probably going to get worried. I think I'd better go. I don't think that's a good idea. Halfway to the door, Corey stopped. A terrible thought rose up from the depths of his mind and seized hold of his brain with the claws of sheer horror. The old man said the nixie could look like anything at once. His mind raced. What if the real Sadie was already dead by the time I woke up to save her? Sadie saw the expression on Corey's face and blanched. What are you thinking, Corey? She asked, sounding a bit defensive. I just don't think you should be wandering around out there after dark. If my grandfather's right, this nixie thing might get you. Corey felt his mouth grow dry as he tried to answer. It makes sense, he thought, trying to stay calm. No, it doesn't, he told himself. Her grandfather's just trying to scare us with that crazy story. Well, she may have fallen for it, but now I'm out of here. My family, Corey said weakly. I've got to get back to my mom, dad, and sisters. Sadie opened her mouth to answer when something thudded, or did it splash, against the door of the small cabin. With a scream, Sadie jumped away. Look, she whispered, and held one hand over her mouth and pointed with the other at the bottom of the door. There was another splashy thud, harder than before, and the wood of the door frame creaked in response. Corey slowly turned to see what Sadie was pointing at, and saw a growing stain of water spread through the crack under the door, as if something very big and wet were standing on the other side. Feeling his control begin to slip, Corey unglued his eyes from the horrible stain and stared at the old man and then at Sadie. They were both trembling. In a flash of terror, Corey knew he had made a mistake. Sadie wasn't the Nixie. After all, if her grandfather was right, the real Nixie was behind that door. Another wet thud threatened to break down the thin barrier between Corey and the wet being that was outside. The wet being was probably a Nixie. It was very angry with him. Oh, poor Corey. So, the greenhouse effect. Yes, we are on voice and stream and on YouTube. You can click on the, you can just listen in voice. You can click on the land music stream button on your viewer, or you click on the media stream button on your viewer, or you can go tune into our YouTube channel, whichever suits you. Or all at once, but that's always not always a great idea. Okay, so Hallie had been putting off her reading assignment for history class all week long. Hallie hated history, and the only fact that she had a quiz tomorrow finally forced her to drag herself back to her room after dinner and open the dreaded textbook. Now, I understand Hallie's feelings on that, and I have some close friends that feel the same way. I've got 5 days to study for this test. No sense doing it until, oh my gosh, it's in 30 minutes. I better study. So, like a last-minute pardon from the governor, though, Hallie got lucky and her phone rang. She snatched up the receiver before the echo of the first ring died away and immediately recognized the voice of her friend Natalie. Hallie, you know, it could. We could be. It's Allie with an H. But the H is silent, so you never know. Hallie snatched up the receiver before the echo of the first ring died away and immediately recognized the voice of her friend Natalie. Although most of the other kids in the school thought Natalie was a bit strange, Hallie had always gotten along fine with her. True, Natalie could be a little weird sometimes, but Hallie actually liked that. She also suspected that she was Natalie's only friend, and she sometimes felt a little sorry for her. "Are you watching TV?" Natalie asked excitedly. "Oh, I wish," Hallie responded, sighing. "I'm studying for the history exam tomorrow. Why?" "Turn it on." "Oh, no, forget it." Natalie's voice trailed off. "What?" Hallie demanded impatiently. "Oh, never mind," Natalie said absently. I'll tell you tomorrow. I've got to study too. See you." Okay," Hallie said hesitantly. "See you tomorrow." She stared at the receiver, then hung up the phone. What was that all about, she wondered. Then with a sigh, she turned back to her history book. The next morning, Hallie cornered Natalie by the locker before the first class. "So what was on TV last night? It was so important," Hallie demanded. Natalie glanced around at the other students to make sure no one could overhear her. "Well, at first I thought I saw my mom on the screen, but it wasn't her. I mean, I'm sure it was her car, but Mom claims it wasn't her in it." "Natalie," Hallie said, holding up a hand to slow her friend down, "what are you talking about?" Her excited friend took a deep breath and tried to explain. "I was watching that new law show, you know, The Scales of Justice. Anyway, they had a scene where one of the lawyers is driving down the street and the car right behind was my mom's." "Cool. Did your mom know she was being filmed?" "That's just it. It wasn't my mom driving." "Was it your dad?" "Hallie, I wouldn't be this excited if it was just my dad that was driving. No, it was a woman, and she looked an awful lot like my mom. I swear, I think she could have been her double." Hallie tried to understand what her friend was so excited about. "So maybe your mom loaned the car to a friend. Does your mom have any friends that look like her?" Natalie shook her head. "Or maybe it wasn't even your mom's car at all. You could have made a mistake, you know." "Hallie, listen to me," Natalie said, looking her friend sternly in the eye. "First of all, it was definitely my mom's car. Same paint job, same broken headlight, same stupid charm thing hanging from the mirror. Second, my mom was never, ever, ever loaned her car to anyone. I think she'd rather loan me to someone than loan her car. And if she had loaned it, why wouldn't she have just said so when I asked her if she was the woman I'd seen, huh?" Hallie frowned. "I still don't see what the big deal is. What are you trying to say, that someone stole—" "That's just it," Natalie interrupted, all of the excitement draining from her voice. "I don't really know what I'm saying. I just thought it was pretty weird, that's all. Like somebody's been using our stuff without us even being aware of it." Hallie felt a small shiver trickle down the back of her neck. Leave it to Natalie to come up with something weird like that. Your mom was sure it wasn't her? She asked. Natalie scowled. I guess so. Actually, she wouldn't really talk to me about it. She was busy with those stupid plants of hers. Hallie nodded. This she understood. Natalie's mom owned a nursery that supplied all this sorts of exotic plants. Unfortunately, most of the plants demanded constant attention. Hallie often thought of Natalie's mom cared more for her plants than she did for Natalie. Hallie and her own mother had talked once or twice about it. It was her mom's opinion it was this lack of attention that made Natalie act odd sometimes. Hon, kids will do just about anything to get attention from their parents, Hallie's mom had told her. Then she had grinned and ruffled Hallie's hair. Except perfect ones like you, honey. Hallie smiled at the thought of how great her relationship with her mom was and felt a twinge of sadness that Natalie and her mom weren't so close. She was just about to offer some words of consolation to her friend when the bell rang for class. The rest of the day went by quickly, and Hallie didn't even have a chance to talk to Natalie again. In fact, by the time that she got home that night, she had pretty much forgotten her friend's story until the phone rang again while she was reading. She picked up the receiver and heard Natalie whisper her name into the phone. Natalie, what's wrong? Why are you whispering? I can't talk too loud, her friend continued in a hushed voice. Listen, I think I figured out what's going on. What do you mean? With the car. I think it was something pretending to be my mother. Hallie's stomach shifted a little, as if it were preparing herself for bad news. Nat, what do you mean, something? Don't you mean someone? Natalie ignored her. Look, I didn't say anything before because I thought it was just me, but my mom's been acting kind of strange lately. Sort of super nice. Anyway, I thought it was because she'd gotten a whole bunch of new plants and she was feeling guilty for spending so much time in the nursery. But now I'm thinking that it's something else. I mean, it's almost like something has taken over her body, something like one of her plants. Hallie, her skin even looks a little green. Hallie's stomach clenched itself into a knot. For the first time in their friendship, she began to wonder if Natalie was completely sane. Natalie, she began while trying to figure out what to say next. Don't you think there's a simpler explanation? Like maybe your mom isn't feeling well? At first I did, yeah, of course. But get this. When I got home today, I found her in the middle of the living room with photos and stuff spread out all over the floor. And, Hallie prompted. And, Natalie continued, I asked her what she was doing. She said she was just reliving some old memories. Sounds reasonable to me, Hallie answered. That's just it, Natalie exclaimed. My mom is the most unsentimental person alive. About 2 months ago, she was going to throw all that stuff out. My dad had to convince her to keep it. Why would she suddenly be so interested in looking through it all unless she was trying to learn something about herself? Hallie tried to figure out what she could say that would calm her friend down. Her first thought was that maybe Natalie's mom had found out she was dying. That would explain why she was going over her past and being extra nice to Natalie. It would even explain why her color looked a bit funny. But how could she say that to Natalie? Terrified she would say the wrong thing, Hallie finally told Natalie to try to get some rest. Look, Nat. Good night's sleep will do you good. In the morning we'll figure something out. Sleep? Natalie softly shrieked. Are you nuts? With my mom? I mean, that thing in the house? Hallie's mind raced. Sure, you have to pretend everything's normal, right? Or else your mom, will know you know something's up, Natalie, and then you'll really be in trouble. Natalie was silent for a moment, and Hallie wondered if she had said the right thing. Yeah, you're right, Natalie whispered. I'll have to act like nothing's going on. Okay, thanks, Hallie. Bye. No problem, Hallie said, convinced her friend had gone off the deep end. I'll see you tomorrow. After hanging up, Hallie began to cry. She didn't know what to do. She knew that she should say something to her parents, but she was afraid of what would happen to Natalie. What if they put her away, she thought, trying to erase images of white rooms and straight-jacketed patients and Vegemite sandwiches that filled her mind. On the other hand, Hallie was also afraid of what would happen to Natalie if she didn't tell someone. Finally, she decided that she would see how her friend was in the morning, and if she hadn't come to her senses, Hallie would convince Natalie to see the school counselor. But the next day, Natalie didn't show up for class, and Hallie found herself hardly able to sit still as she anxiously waited for the final bell to ring. When it did, she bolted out of her seat like she'd gotten an electric shock and raced toward Natalie's house. A plan had formed in Hallie's mind while she had squirmed through her long school day, and now she definitely had decided to carry it out. If Natalie's home, then I'll try to talk some sense into her, Hallie told herself. At least I'll try to get her to talk to someone else about this besides me. But what Hallie could barely admit to herself was that the scary thought that Natalie might not be home, that she'd done something crazy like run away. If that were the case, Hallie didn't know what she'd do. Maybe she'd even have to consider talking to Natalie's mother about it. When Hallie reached Natalie's house, she rang the bell. After waiting a few minutes, she tried it again, then tried knocking a few times, and then, just as she was about to give up, Natalie's mom came to the door. "Oh, hi, Mrs. Porter," Hallie said nervously. She had caught herself looking for the greenish tinge in the woman's skin. Is Natalie home?" Natalie's mom looked confused. "Why do you ask?" Hallie looked at her feet, so Natalie wasn't home. Now what could she say? Because, well, actually, I really need to talk to you, Mrs. Porter. Would it be all right if I came in for a moment?" Mrs. Porter smiled broadly and opened the door. Hallie stepped into the living room and tried to think of a good way to tell Natalie's mother that her daughter was crazy. "I'm not exactly sure how to say this, Mrs. Porter, but have you noticed anything funny about Natalie lately?" "Funny? How do you mean?" Mrs. Porter asked. "Well, like if she didn't seem to trust you or want to be near you." Mrs. Porter crossed her arms and regarded Hallie with genuine curiosity. "Perhaps you'd better tell me what you're getting at." Hallie shifted uncomfortably. "Well, you see, Natalie called me the other night, and she was saying some pretty, strange things about you." Hallie went on to describe, as kindly as possible, the outbursts of her friend and the things Natalie had said about her mother. She finished by saying, "I was going to try to talk to Natalie some more today at school, but she didn't show up, so I thought I'd better come over here and see if everything was all right." Natalie's mom listened carefully to every word of Hallie's story and seemed to take the news rather calmly. Instead of yelling or getting angry, she simply smiled faintly and shook her head. "Oh, yes. Thank you for your concern. I already knew most of this. You see, Natalie and I had a long talk last night, but I assume it was after she spoke to you." Hallie felt a faint stirring of hope inside her. "And is everything all right?" "Oh, now it is, yes," Natalie's mom said. "Now, since I've decided to divide my time more evenly between Natalie and my plants. In fact, that's why she missed school today. We've spent the day together in the nursery." Hallie's tiny hope expanded and showed itself on her face in a wide grin. "That's great. I hope you're not mad at me for butting in." "Oh, no, not at all," Mrs. Porter responded warmly. "I'm glad to know Natalie has someone to confide in." Hallie couldn't stop herself from grinning as she turned toward the door. "Well, when Natalie gets home, tell her to give me a call, okay?" "Oh," Mrs. Porter said, holding out a hand to stop Hallie. "Natalie's home. She's out back in the greenhouse." "Really?" Hallie asked, thinking how Natalie always said she'd had enough of those stupid plants and never wanted to go out there. In fact, she'd never even take Hallie out to see it. "Can I go see her?" Of course you can. Let me take you," Natalie's mom said happily. Mrs. Porter led Hallie through the house to the backyard, which was filled with tropical trees, sweet-scented flowers, dark green vines, and lush ferns. They pushed their way through the miniature jungle to the door of the greenhouse, where Mrs. Porter motioned Hallie inside. Whereas the garden had smelled wonderfully sweet, the scent in the greenhouse was nearly overpowering. Right next to the door was an enormous plant with thick pink buds, and at the top of the plant was an open flower that seemed to wave gently in the breeze coming through the open door. Hallie stopped next to this enormous plant and looked around in wonder, then turned to Mrs. Porter. "Where's Natalie?" "Behind you," Mrs. Porter said matter-of-factly. Hallie turned around in confusion and bent to look around the large plant that stood next to her, and then at that moment she felt something sharp prick her on the neck. "Ow!" she said, bringing her hand up to swat at whatever it was. She felt something thin and sticky clinging to her neck and jerked her head back to see what was on her. That's when she saw a white, ropey tendril coming from the plant by the door. Apparently it had snaked out of the odd plant and slapped onto her neck. "Oh, yuck!" Hallie said, tugging at the gummy tendril, but she couldn't get it loose from her skin. Growing terrified, she turned to say something to the oddly calm Mrs. Porter. When she tried to move, Hallie found she suddenly had no control over her body. In fact, she felt like she was floating outside of herself, and then without warning, her body slumped to the floor and her head fell against the horrible plant that had hold of her. Spreading quickly through her body, the plant's poison numbed her vocal cords and froze her mouth, keeping her from screaming when she saw what was concealed behind the monster plant. It was Natalie, or the shell of her body, now thickly covered with roots. With great effort, the poison was now spreading fast through every inch of her body. Hallie turned her eyes toward Mrs. Porter and saw the once kind expression on the woman's face had turned into an evil grin. "You shouldn't plant your nose where it doesn't belong," the horrible woman said, letting out a low chuckle of delight as she turned to walk out of the greenhouse. Looking up as the room went dim, Hallie saw the last sight of her life. There, growing from the plant that loomed above her head, was one of its huge pink buds, and it seemed to be molding itself into the outline of a little girl. A little girl that looked just like her. The greenhouse effect. I guess maybe there is some kind of greenhouse effect going on in the world. Land down under. What does shunder mean anyway? Glow and shunder. Next story. Dead in the water. Dead in the water. Flying foxes. Yeah, they eat mosquitoes, you know. Some people like the flying foxes, but then they do spiders for some crazy reason. Maybe it has something to do with mosquitoes. I don't know. It was a beautiful summer day. Beyond the calm, sheltered waters of the marina, dozens of pleasure boats bobbed up and down the gentle swells off the coast of Florida. Smiling, Rosa Mendez watched them from her perch at the end of one of the docks. She loved boats, and since the marina was only a mile from her house, she spent plenty of time there. Her dad had been in the Navy and already taught her lots about tides and currents and navigations and even how to tie knots. Now she would be able to really use everything she had learned. "Hey, Rosa!" someone called to her. She turned and saw her friend Talia, a tall, thin girl with a mane of dark red hair. Talia was waving from the narrow strip of beach that separated the docks from the tree-lined parking lot. Rosa waved back as the girl jogged across the white sand toward her. "What are you grinning about?" Talia asked breathlessly, plopping down next to Rosa. Rosa's smile widened. "You're not going to believe this. It's so cool." "Don't tell me. Let me guess." Talia's expression took on a mischievous air. She closed her eyes and put her fingers to her temples as if trying to receive a cosmic message. This Andy Rubin has asked you to help him with his math homework." Rosa blushed. Her friend was the only person who knew about her crush on Andy Rubin. "No, it's even better," she said, then waited for a moment to make her announcement more dramatic. "Well, my parents bought a boat at an auction," Rosa proclaimed with delight. "It's a cabin cruiser. As soon as we get it all fixed up, we're going to take it out for a couple of weeks to the Bahamas. Sleep on board and everything." Talia's forehead creased with concern. Even though her dad was a fisherman, she'd been brought up near the ocean, she didn't share Rosa's love of boats. "Fix it up? What's wrong with it?" "Oh, nothing much," Rosa answered. "The man at the auction said it had been abandoned and was probably out at sea for a while before somebody found it. It just needs to be cleaned up, and Dad says the engine needs a little work." Talia's mouth dropped open. "Abandoned? Oh, no. You don't mean the Sea Wind? Your folks didn't really buy the Sea Wind?" "Yeah, the Sea Wind. That's it. How did you know? What's the problem with it?" Rosa asked. "Well, my dad told me all about that," Talia said. "He was down at the dock when Hank Peters towed it in." Talia paused and looked around even though there was no one nearby, and then lowered her voice to a whisper. "Hank said it was floating in the triangle. There was no sign of the crew. All anyone knows is that they're a family out of Port Wiley, the parents and two boys. Nobody knows what happened to them. Hank says the boat is jinxed, so it belongs out there, and so does anything or anyone on it." Rosa rolled her eyes, realizing that Talia was talking about the Bermuda Triangle, a huge patch of open ocean that stretched from Miami to the islands of Puerto Rico and Bermuda. Some people, including Talia's dad, believed that there was something sinister, maybe supernatural, going on within it. Something that caused an unusually high number of boats and even airplanes in the region to mysteriously disappear. "Oh, come on," Rosa said with a giggle. "You don't really believe all that stuff." "You shouldn't laugh. What do you think happened to those people who were on the Sea Wind? Where are they?" Talia's expression turned somber as she looked out toward the horizon. High above, a huge bank of cottony clouds sailed across the face of the ocean, dimming its light. The ocean turned into a dreary leaden gray. "I don't know. Maybe they got washed overboard in a storm, or maybe they..." Rose's voice drifted off. She hadn't really thought about the former crew of the boat until now, and she didn't think she wanted to think about it. I don't know what happened to them. Maybe they were kidnapped by aliens. And she's trying to lighten the mood. If they show up, we'll just have to give the boat back. But the Sea Wind is ours now. Maybe we'll change the name to something a little more cheerful. You can't do that, Talia cautioned. It's very bad luck to change the name of a boat. Oh, another superstition? Rosa said, shaking her head. Come on, Talia, get real. It's almost the 21st century. There's no place for that kind of mumbo-jumbo anymore. It is the 21st century, dummy, and sure there is. There's always room for that mumbo-jumbo, Talia replied, brushing a stray strand of hair from her eyes. Out there, she gestured seaward, anything is possible. 2 weeks later, Rosa sat cross-legged on her very own bunk on the Sea Wind. She thought about Talia's fears and chuckled to herself. The boat was as cool as she thought it would be. Below the deck there was a bathroom and a galley, and each of the 4 comfortable bunks had sliding doors. There was plenty of room for her parents, her older sister Anita, who was come home from college for the summer. Rosa was glad that Anita was able to join them, even if she was useless when it came to boats. Hey, Rosie, she heard her dad's voice calling from up on deck. Come on up, honey, I have a surprise for you. Coming, Dad, she called. Rosa blinked as she stepped onto the deck in the bright sunlight. Her parents and her sister were standing on the dock admiring something on the back of the boat. When she arrived this morning, that part of the boat had been mysteriously covered with a large canvas tarp. Now she was about to learn what had been under it. She hopped down and joined her family. Look at this, Anita said brightly. It's Zaphod. No. Rosa glanced to where her sister pointed, then gasped. Where the name Seawind had once been printed in dark block letters, it now read, Anita Rose in an elegant script. You changed the name, Rosa murmured, remembering Talia's warning. Do you like it, sweetie? Sure, Dad. It's great. And we have another surprise for you, her mother said, adding, slipping her arm around Rosa's waist. Your dad has managed to take off from work sooner than we expected, so we're going to sleep on board tonight and leave on our trip first thing in the morning. It was just going to be a 3-hour tour, but we're going out. Overnight. Aren't you excited? That night, Rosa was too excited to sleep, in fact. She had practically forgotten all about her friend's superstition about changing the name of the boat. She stretched out on her bunk and listened to the rhythmic sound of her sister's breathing in the lower bunk. Anita could fall asleep no matter what was going on, upside down in a turnip box even. There were other noises, too. Laughter and faint strains of jukebox music drifted from the direction of the all-night diner on the other side of the marina, the side where the fishermen docked their boats. Rosa thought about Talia's father and Hank Peters, wondering what sort of strange stories the fishermen were exchanging tonight. She yawned, rolled over to face the open door of the cabin, and froze. Someone was standing in the doorway of her cabin. Rosa could barely make out the phantom-like silhouette of a boy, perhaps her own age. Slowly he raised his hand and beckoned to her. His face and hands took on a greenish glow, and she could see that he was smiling banefully. Shivering from fright, she reached over the edge of her bunk, gripped her sister's shoulder, and squeezed. Ah! With a shriek, Anita sat straight up, banging her head on the edge of Rosa's bunk. Wow! What's going on? Who? The figure of the boy melted away into the shadows. A light came on, and Rosa's mother appeared in the doorway. What on earth are you girls doing? She asked, her tone tinged with irritation. Anita rubbed the top of her head. I don't know. Ask her, she said, gesturing toward Rosa. I was asleep, and she grabbed me. There was someone in here, Rosa cried out. I saw him. He was standing right there. Her mother looked from side to side. She peeked into the head and then checked the sliding door that led to the deck. It's not possible, honey. The door's locked. There's nowhere anyone could hide without us seeing him. You must have just imagined it. Now try to get some sleep. We're leaving as soon as it's light. Rosa closed her eyes, but in her mind she could still see the shadow of the boy. Was it an omen? She shook her head. I'm starting to sound like Talia, she thought, still glad that the course her dad had planned would not take them too far into the waters of the Bermuda Triangle. You could leave a little room for somebody else to move, Anita complained as the two girls jostled each other while getting dressed the next morning. Well, excuse me, Your Highness, Rosa snapped back. She slipped into a pair of shorts and a tank top, grabbed a donut from the galley, and scooted up on deck. It was a beautiful morning, warm and clear. You ready to shove off? Her dad asked. Ready, Captain, Rosa replied with a salute. The engines roared to life, and Anita rose, made her way slowly toward the open ocean. Rosa trembled slightly as she watched the mainland slip farther and farther away. The following nightfall found them anchored offshore from the Grand Bahama Island, and Rosa's nervousness was seeping away. There's nothing to be afraid of, she told herself as she helped her mom prepare a salad for dinner. The family ate their meal on deck under a starry sky, while nearby the twinkling lights of the island reflected on the calm night black water. What are those lights over there? Nita asked, pointing in a direction away from the island. Huh. I don't know, her dad answered, squinting into the darkness. I don't think there's any land out there. Must be another boat or something. Rosa followed their gaze and saw a faint greenish glow on the surface of the water a short distance away. The light doesn't look like it's on a boat. It looks like it's floating right on the water. Her mom raised an eyebrow. Oh, that's not possible. Look, Anita interrupted. The light began to expand slightly. Then it was joined by another. The pair of lights moved very slowly in the direction of the Anita Rose, then blinked out. For a moment, everyone was silent. Finally, Rosa's dad softly intoned the familiar theme music to the old Twilight Zone television program. I can see why there's so many stories about this area. Yeah, but what was it? Anita asked. Her dad shook her head. Well, I'm sure it was nothing out of the ordinary. For now, we'll just have to say it was a UFO, an underwater floating object. Well, we better get the dishes cleared away, and then the girls can get to bed, Rosa's mom said, changing the subject. We're going to be up nice and early in the morning. Although she was very tired, Rosa slept fitfully, tossing and turning in her bunk. The shadowy image of the boy she had seen or imagined on her first night on the boat kept plaguing her dreams. At one point, she dreamed that he had grabbed her and was shaking her. Rosa, wake up! Rosa allowed herself to be pulled into a sitting position. She opened her eyes and saw her sister's face. Anita was terrified. What's wrong? Rosa asked in confusion. Mom and Dad are missing. What are you talking about? Anita croaked out an answer. The island is gone. Everything's gone. The anchor must have come loose or something. Rosa pushed past her sister, checked her parents' cabin, then raced up on deck. Suddenly all she could see was huge ocean swells under a tumultuous gray sky. The boat rocked perilously on the waves. This is crazy. Suddenly her eyes lit up. The radio. We can call for help. Remembering what her father had taught her, she tried to make contact, but there was nothing but static. Can anyone hear me? She screamed into the mouthpiece. Please, we need help. Next, she tried to start the engine. I tried that already, Anita said. It's hopeless. Rosa gripped the rails and gazed down into the sea. An icy rain soaked her to the skin and set her teeth to chattering, but she ignored it. There has to be a way to... She stopped and squinted, looking out at the churning whitecaps. Look! In the distance, the greenish lights they had seen the night before appeared from the depths of the choppy sea. The wind howled, the waves pounded against the sides of the helpless craft. A bolt of blue-green lightning scissored across the sky, followed by a crescendo of thunder, and then all became light and quiet. The rain ceased. The ocean settled to a glassy stillness as a light fog settled on its surface. It was as if the storm had never happened. Suddenly, they huddled together. Rosa and Anita stared in disbelief as the lights moved closer and closer to them, finally slipping out of view from under the hull. The Anita Rose began to gleam slightly and then came to a dead stop. For a moment, the girls simply held on to each other, shivering from fear and cold. Then Rosa felt a scream rise in her own throat as a slim, bony hand gripped the rail and something pulled itself up from the sea onto the deck. It was the phantom boy of her nightmare. He smelled of salt and putrid flesh, and there was seaweed tangled in his hair. It is time, he rasped, reaching for her. Her breath caught in her throat as the hideous boy gripped her wrist with icy fingers. You have reached the end of your journey. No! Rosa bellowed. She twisted around only to see her sister in the grip of another older boy. He too seemed to be something that belonged at the bottom of the sea. From the corner of her eye, she saw that other grotesque beings with pale, sagging flesh were dragging themselves up over the railings. Rosa turned back and gasped in horror. Her mother and father stood before her. Their skin was pale and shriveled, and their eyes were clouded over. It's no use, the boy whispered mournfully. There's only one destination for those who travel on the sea wind. Slowly he tugged the struggling girl toward the waiting sea. The young sailor turned the key, and the engine started up immediately, then faltered and stopped. I don't see much wrong with it, he informed the older man who was leaning against the rail. I think we get this thing fixed. Little work should be in ship shape, ready to go again. Yeah, there's nobody on board. That's weird, another young man reported as he climbed up from below the deck. The older man shook his head. Well, I guess we better get back to the ship and throw a tow line on her. Looks like she's been out here for a while, floating around. What are you supposed to happen to the crew, Captain? The sailor asked reluctantly. The older man glanced out over the open sea. I don't know, and I'm not sure I want to know. So that was dead in the water. Whoa. Turn like the minnow, yes. Minnow with the mackerel. Okay, our next one is called Hate House. But it's not hate, it's hate. H-A-I-G-H-T. Jana Parks sat quietly in a big blue wing chair. She ran her fingers along the lacy doilies draped neatly over each arm. Her Aunt Gilda and her great-aunt Jessica sat across from her on the velvet couch and sipped their tea. In the next room, Jana's great-grandfather lay near death. It's such a shame, Gilda said politely. It's nothing of the kind, Jessica remarked. Grady has lived his life. He lived it the way he wanted without much thought to anyone else, like his father before him. Jessica, Gilda chided, it isn't right to speak so poorly of the dying, especially in front of the child. Jana rolled her eyes. After all, she was almost 13. Jana, her mother called as she stepped into the quiet parlor. Great-grandpa wants to see you. The girl stood reluctantly and joined her mother. Do I have to, Mom? She whispered as they reached the door to the bedroom. I mean, I haven't seen him since I was a baby. He's not going to live much longer, dear. If you want to say goodbye, it'll have to be now. He's already lived to be 95, Jana said coldly. Her mother scowled. Jana, you may not care very much for the man, but he has left us this house, and right now we have nowhere else to go. The least you can do is pay your respects. Jana slowly opened the door and looked in at her great-grandfather lying on his back in the huge canopy bed. His wild white hair was spread out on a down pillow, and his ancient quilt covered his frail body. As she stepped closer, he opened his eyes. Leave us, he wheezed at Jana's mother, who glanced nervously at her daughter before exiting. Once they were alone, the old man raised a gnarled hand and gestured for Jana to come closer. You don't care very much for me, do you? He wheezed. Jana just stared at him indifferently. That doesn't matter, he went on. We are alike, you and I. I can sense it. Really? The girl replied, scanning the room. His lips turned up in a grotesque pantomime of a smile. I have something for you, Jana. Jana's eyes suddenly lit up with interest. It is your legacy. Over there. He pointed to a small wooden box on the table beside his bed. Jana moved closer and lifted the lid. Inside, resting on the blood-red satin, was a golden locket. Oh, it's beautiful, she said softly, taking it from the box and holding it to the light. Then you'll take it, he cried, suddenly grabbing her warm hand in his cold, bony claw. Jana pulled her hand free, and the old man fell back against the pillow. The only sound in the room was that of her own breathing. Sure, I'll take it, she said, examining the locket more closely. Jana was so taken by the golden locket that she hadn't noticed the old man had stopped breathing, and his eyes stared unblinkingly up at the ceiling now. 2 months later, Jana leaned against the magazine rack of the Midland Market and flipped through the pages of Teen Time magazine. She was eavesdropping on two women gossiping in line about the jagged ruins on Lookout Hill at the north end of town, the remains of the old Haight Mansion. It's an eyesore, the woman with the pink curlers in her hair grumbled. I don't see why they don't clear all that Haight Mansion and rubble away. You know why they don't clear away the Haight Mansion, the second woman said, lowering her voice slightly. Jana knew, too. Most residents of Midland considered the old ruins haunted. That didn't scare Jana at all. She thought it might even be fun to see a ghost. One of her favorite movies was Poltergeist, and she'd even been to a seance at a friend's house when she lived in the city. She'd been up to Haight House twice since her great-grandfather had died, and she and her mom had moved into his old home in Midland. It was kind of creepy, but she hadn't seen anything there that couldn't be explained. In fact, lots of the local kids would go up there after school or on the weekends. It was fun to climb around on the crumbled walls and what was left of the rusty old wrought iron staircase. Most of the kids claimed that they were not even afraid to, and even bragged about what they would do if they ever saw a ghost, but none of them would visit the hill after dark. The house had burned down in a terrible blaze 80 years before. Jeffrey Haight, as they called them. Jeffrey Haight, his wife, and their 2 young daughters had been trapped inside. A freak windstorm had fanned the flames into a hellish fury. There had been no chance to rescue anyone. It was all a terrible twist of fate, and there were rumors only hinted at that the disaster had been no accident, that it had been set on purpose, and the spirits of the family were not at rest. "You going to buy that, or you just going to read it here?" someone said curtly. Jana looked up to see the clerk glaring at her. She slipped the magazine back into the rack and paid for the carton of milk her mom had sent her to buy. Outside, Jana pulled her gloves out of her jacket pocket, slipped them on, and gazed up at Lookout Hill. The summit appeared darker than the surrounding countryside. The shrubs were all overgrown. A small but ominous patch of mist hugged the treetops. It did look a little spooky, even on an otherwise bright fall afternoon. At home, Jana let the kitchen door slam behind her. "Is that you, Jana? Did you get the milk?" she heard her mother call from the living room. "Yeah," Jana replied, picking up a cookie from a plate in the kitchen and peeking down the short hall. Her mom was curled up at the edge of the couch with her telephone receiver pressed to her ear. She was laughing. It hadn't taken her long to renew all of her old friendships. She'd grown up in Midland, and many of her relatives and the high school friends still lived in the area, as they had for generations. Jana scowled, thinking that her mother should at least pretend that she was a little sad about her divorce and about having to move away from the city. Finally, she just shrugged, grabbed another cookie, and headed back outside. She and her new friend, Kara, were going to the library to pick out a topic for the history project. They planned to first meet at the ruins. By the time Jana clambered up the wide steps of the entrance to Haight House, she was a little out of breath. It was the first time she had been up here alone. She leaned against one of the cracked stone lions that guarded what once had been the front porch, and she looked around. Part of the chimney and the north wall was still standing, but the rest of the walls had long since tumbled and lay scattered around the grounds, along with a few charred and rotting timbers. Clusters of weeds and tall grass sprouted among the heaps of bricks. It was easy to see where the main floor had been. For some reason, nothing would grow there. With the exception of the fallen metal staircase and a few piles of scorched bricks and mortar, it was completely bare. As she gazed at the ruins, Jana touched the antique gold locket she wore around her neck. She had been wearing it ever since the day her great-grandfather had given it to her. Through the locket, she felt somehow closer to the deceased old man. It was as if they shared a strange bond between the living and the dead through some twist of fate, perhaps. Jana loosened her grip on the pocket. Jana loosened her grip on the locket and looked around. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what the Haight house had been like before the fire. At first her mind was just a jumble of thoughts, but then something began to happen. The chills seemed to drain out of the air. The stone lion felt warmer against her back. The gentle wind grew more forceful, tugging at Jana's hair and causing the leaves to scutter across the dry ground. She squeezed her eyes even tighter. "Good night, fairy. Sweet dreams." Suddenly, gradually, an image came into her mind. She was still leaning against the lion, but now there was a beautiful carved oak door before her. Slowly the large polished brass knob turned, and the door began to swing open. As if in a trance, Jana stepped into a large entry hall, lit mainly by glowing candles. A silver vase filled with sweet-smelling honeysuckle caught her eye, and here was something else. A presence. Then suddenly something touched her shoulder. Jana gasped and pulled away, her heart pounding. "Whoa, don't freak out," Kara exclaimed. Jana stared wide-eyed at her friend. The wind had stopped, and the hillside was as still and quiet as a tomb. "Sorry," she said at last with embarrassment. "I was daydreaming. You startled me." Kara smiled. "This place is supposed to give people nightmares, not daydreams. What were you thinking about?" "I was wondering what it was like a long time ago, you know?" Jana picked up a small pebble and threw it toward the staircase. It hit with a dull twang. "It's strange, but I can imagine it, almost like I've been here before." Kara frowned at her. "You're giving me the creeps. Don't talk like that." She wrinkled up her nose. "Are you wearing some kind of perfume?" "No. Why?" Jana asked, remembering the vase of honeysuckle in her daydream. "Nothing. Have you thought about what you want to do for history class?" Kara answered, changing the subject. She seemed a little uneasy. All at once, Jana's eyes lit up. "I have an idea," she announced excitedly. "Let's do a report on this place." Kara looked Doubtful. But we're supposed to write about a historical event. Of course, Janet continued. And what could be more perfect than an event in the history of Midland? Besides, all I've ever heard are secondhand stories about it. She turned towards the ruins, and her voice trailed off into a whisper. Something about the place was drawing her in. I'd like to find out what really happened here. Well, I don't think anyone knows for sure, said Kira. But if you want to, I suppose we could ask Mrs. Potter. She used to run the Heritage Society. Her house is just down the hill anyway, Kira said with very little enthusiasm. It didn't take long to get to Mrs. Potter's. Janet rang the bell, but no one answered. Try knocking, Kira advised. She doesn't hear very well. Janet banged firmly on the door. A moment later was answered by a small, gray-haired woman wearing baggy clothes and soiled gardening gloves. She was holding a gardening trowel. Yes. Can I help you, girls? Kira stepped forward. Mrs. Potter, she said in a loud voice, I'm Kira Sherman. My dad owns the pharmacy. She nodded towards Janet. This is Jana Parks. We want to do a history report on Haight House, and we were wondering if you had any information about it. The old woman smiled and patted down a few wisps of gray hair. Howard Sherman's daughter. Well, let me see. I can't remember the last time anyone even asked about the old Haight place. It isn't a very pleasant part of our town history. But Mr. Potter, rest his soul, had an interest in it. Come to think of it, I might have something that would help you. She stepped back and held the door open wider. Come in. The house was dark and filled with old-fashioned furnishings. Mrs. Potter guided the girls into the parlor and told them to have a seat on the couch. Mrs. Potter rushed off and returned shortly with a faded cardboard banker's box. There's some old news reports in here. She placed them on the coffee table. The story actually made the papers in Springfield. There's a few photographs, a couple of keepsakes, too, but not many. I understand there really wasn't much left after the fire. Apparently no one wanted to poke around, She prattled on some. My mother told me about the family. She said they had trouble fitting in here. They were from Europe or somewhere, and the locals never really trusted them. Seems the family kept to themselves in the fancy house up on the hill. Still, it's sad. The two girls are about your age. It must have been a terrible fate. Mrs. Potter shook her head. Well, I have to get back to my garden, all right? I'll leave you two here to your research. Just let yourselves out when you're finished. Jenna nodded and slipped the top off the box. It smelled musty. The first newspaper article included a picture of the original house and told of the fire and how the family had been unable to get out. Look at this, Jenna said with surprise, holding the brittle paper out to Kira. According to this article, the house burned down exactly 80 years ago tonight. Kira glanced up. She had a strange expression on her face. Read this one, she said softly. Janet took the folded newspaper and glanced over the yellowed page, then gasped. It was more of an accusation than a report. It's just like the rumors. It says that the circumstances surrounding the fire were suspicious, that no one made any attempt to put it out or to rescue anyone. According to this, a couple of local kids had even accused the family of being into sorcery and blamed them when a few townspeople mysteriously started getting sick. Look, there's a note at the bottom that says the illnesses were actually caused by something in the town water supply. Dana looked back at Kara. Do you think it could have been said on purpose? Kara didn't answer. She was staring at a photograph in the box. Dana reached in and held the picture in her trembling hands. The Haight family gazed back at her in the faded tones of brown, cream, and gray. The features weren't clear, but one thing was unmistakable. At her throat, the youngest daughter wore a locket, exactly like the one that now hung around Jana's neck. I don't believe it, Jana murmured. Kara looked at the picture and back to Jana. What does it mean? For a moment, Jana didn't answer. Then a smile crept across her face. I don't know. I'm going to find out. How? Kara asked. I'm going back up to the ruins, Jana said firmly. I was starting to get a strange feeling when I was there before, and I think you sensed it too, remember? She searched her friend's face pleadingly. You thought you smelled perfume. Kara frowned and bit her lower lip. I don't know. Maybe we should just leave well enough alone. Oh, come on, Janet coaxed. I just want to check it out. Come with me. It'll be dark soon, Kara reminded her. We can go tomorrow. It has to be now. Jana responded stubbornly. The house burned down 80 years ago tonight. I'm going, even if I have to go alone. Kara scowled and placed the top back on the banker's box. Well, I guess you're going to go alone. Be slithering up there by yourself. Fine, Jana said angrily. The sun was low over the western horizon by the time Jana was slithering up and once again stood on the front steps of Haight House. The clouds looked like red tongues of flame in the darkening sky. She stepped on the bare ground that had been the site of the house itself. As she did, she felt a wave of warmth course down her spine. She continued until she stood at what would have been the heart of the house. Around the wind began to moan. Remembering what had happened at the seance she'd attended in the city, Jana closed her eyes and spoke aloud. I'm here, Jeffrey Haight. If you want to contact me, I am here. The voice of the wind grew to a wail, and the tops of the trees began to dip and sway furiously. Jana tried desperately to control her ragged breathing as Haight House materialized before her eyes. She hadn't truly expected anything to happen, and the shock of it all left her virtually paralyzed. This is impossible, she whimpered. Once again she smelled the sweet odor of honeysuckle, and she watched as her fire roared to life in the fireplace. Instead of barren dirt, there was a polished wooden floor beneath her feet. Outside, the wind howled and shook the panes of the phantom windows. The sound of a man's voice caused her to freeze. Jana, the voice said. It sounded as if it came from a million miles away. Slowly, Jana turned to face the spirit of Jeffrey Haight, his wife and daughters at his side, ashen with pale, staring eyes. Jana opened her mouth to speak, but nothing came out. The family looked just like they had in the photograph. The youngest daughter was glaring at the locket that rested on Jana's throat. We have been waiting for you to return, Jeffrey Haight hissed menacingly. Shivering, Jana found her voice. I didn't mean any harm. I didn't really think. I mean, please let me leave. I don't belong here. Oh, but you do belong here. The phantom grinned evilly as the walls of the spectral mansion burst into flames, whipped higher by the gale-force winds. Doesn't it all seem familiar? Don't you remember? With a horrified scream, Jana ran to the door, but found it locked. Smoke began to fill the huge hall, and the eyes of Jeffrey Haight glowed red. Jana raced to the nearest window, began to pound on it, but it burned her hands and refused to give way. The heat was unbearable. All around her the wood floors were blistering and cracking. You're making a mistake, Jana repleaded. You have the wrong person. Jeffrey Haight glared at the locket around Jana's neck. Mistaken? I beg to differ. It was your mistake or misfortune, I don't care which, to accept that locket from the monster who set this fire, your own great-grandfather. All at once the blood seemed to rush out of Jana's legs. But Jeffrey Haight smiled evilly. Twisted by his jealousy and fear of anyone or anything different, your great-grandfather murdered my family, and now he has passed the legacy of his crime onto you, and you accepted it willingly. The phantom Haight house began to shudder and fall in on itself. No! Jana screamed as bricks and mortar tumbled down, and Jeffrey Haight uttered his final curse. Now you will pay your family's debt to us. At last. Ooh, wow. Haight house. Yes, Jana is actually a nickname for Ginny. Ginny's a nickname for Jana. You're right. Good catch. Okay. The next one is called Gravelings. Or rather, I retitled it Gravelings because I liked it better. Exact change only. Amanda glanced at the small printed sign as she dropped 3 quarters into the meter and turned to find a seat on the bus. 75 cents. Man, I don't think I'd spend 3 quarters on anything except maybe a couple of games of Centipede. Well, anyway. Amanda liked to sit in the window seat next to the exit door. Her grandfather told her it was the safest seat in case of a collision, next to the exit door, dear. She wasn't really worried about the bus crashing, but Gramps had always emphasized the importance of being prepared for anything. It'll give you an edge, he said to her one day while they were working together in the garden. If you can see something coming, you can always protect yourself. He hadn't taken his own advice, though. Gramps had died in a freak car accident 6 months ago. The doctor said he probably would have survived if he had just been wearing his seatbelt. The bus wasn't very crowded, and Amanda smiled when she saw that her preferred place was vacant. She slid into it, plopped her pile of library books on the empty seat next to her, and looked at her watch. She'd stayed a little too long at the library after school and would probably be late for dinner. It might have been faster to just walk home. It was only 6 blocks. But her books were heavy, and she was a little tired. "Can't you see it? Can't you see it?" someone behind her moaned. "It's right next to you. For heaven's sake, someone do something. Can't you see it?" Amanda turned slightly and saw an elderly woman hunched up in a seat 2 rows back. The woman looked very shabby. Long strands of frizzy gray hair poked out from under a baseball cap she was wearing, and her dirty hands were clutching a grimy canvas bag. "You see it, don't you? You do, don't you?" the woman begged, turning her watery eyes on Amanda. Amanda looked in the direction the woman was pointing, seemingly toward a balding, middle-aged man seated across the aisle. The man was doing his best to read a newspaper and ignore the commotion. The old woman rose unsteadily to her feet and moved into the aisle. Her breath was labored and her face was flushed. Tiny droplets of sweat glistened on her forehead. "I'm warning you," she shouted at the man, then grabbed the newspaper and ripped it from his hands. "You've got to listen to me. It wants to hurt you." "Are you crazy, lady?" the balding man yelled back. "Get away from me." Then everything happened so fast. Seeing the disturbance in his rearview mirror, the driver immediately pulled the bus over the curb and came to a stop. The middle-aged man jumped up, pushed the old woman out of his way. Then he slammed open the exit door and escaped from his tormentor, who stumbled and fell into the seat next to Amanda, scattering books across the floor. "Don't let him go," the old woman pleaded, grabbing Amanda by her sweater and pulling her close. Amanda tried to turn away. She could feel the woman's hot breath on her face. "It'll get him. He must be warned. It'll get him," the old woman groaned, tears rolling down her cheeks. Amanda looked at the withered hands that held her so tightly and saw that they were covered with deep red rash. "The doctors think I'm crazy. They think the fever has made me mad. It's true. It's true. But my affliction is my salvation. It's given me the sight. It's enabled me to see those creatures. They're everywhere. They're everywhere. Their only purpose is to torment us. They toy with us, always waiting until they're ready to strike. But I can see them. They can never get me as long as I can see them coming." She touched her reddened hand to Amanda's face. "This is my gift to you, child. It is not madness. It is deliverance." The driver and another young man came to Amanda's rescue, pulling the old woman to her feet. Suddenly a squeal of brakes and screech of tires drew everyone's attention to the street. Seconds later, a sickening thud echoed through the bus. "I told you," the old woman wailed. "They got him." Shaking, Amanda collected her books and raced out the open door. A crowd was already gathering around the man who had been struck by a car. Amanda was stunned to see that it was the balding passenger from the bus, the same one the old woman had been harassing. "Oh, you poor little thing." Amanda's mother did her best to soothe her daughter as the frightened girl sobbed about her story when she arrived home. "That's it. I don't want you coming home on the city bus anymore." "Yeah, if you need to go to the library after school, I'll ask Mr. Moore to let me out of work early, so I can take you up myself, okay, hon?" her father added with concern. "I think you're a little feverish, dear," her mother fretted, putting her hand to her daughter's forehead. "And what is this?" Holding Amanda's arm, she pointed at a light red rash that ran from wrist to elbow. "I'm okay, Mom," Amanda replied, though she did feel very tired. "No, I don't think you are. We're going to get you into bed immediately. If that rash isn't gone by morning, we'll take you to see Dr. Roth." Amanda's mother helped her to her room. The girl's head had begun to ache, and a long rest was starting to sound like a good idea. "Sleep tight, honey," her mom said, kissing her softly on her forehead and turning out the light. "I've left your window open a little so you can get some air." Amanda stared at the shadows dancing across her wall. The city never seemed to tire. Outside, a distant siren whined. She wondered what it would be like to live in the country instead of in a big city, in a place where the night was completely dark and quiet. She kicked her blankets off and pushed her hair away from her face. It was oppressively hot in her bedroom. Several hours must have passed before Amanda woke again. She listened for the sound of the TV, but the apartment was completely quiet now. She felt incredibly thirsty. Her throat was dry and her lips parched, so she slipped out of bed and tiptoed down the hall toward the kitchen. Then, a glass of water in hand, she crept back to her room. Amanda sat wearily on the edge of her bed, took a cool sip of water, and placed the chilled glass against her cheek. Maybe I am getting a fever, she thought, rubbing her temples. And she felt achy all over, too. A slight scratching noise drew Amanda's attention to the window. Her heart began to pound at a frightening pace. She barely felt the glass slip from her fingers and shatter on the hardwood floor. There, clinging to the ledge outside the window, was a ghastly living nightmare. It looked like one of those stone gargoyles that crouch at the corners of old buildings. Its blue-green scales glittered in the moonlight. It had long, talon-tipped fingers, and it glared at Amanda with menacing yellow eyes. It was what Georgia Lass would know as a graveling. I'm dreaming, Amanda moaned. The creature lapped at its scaly lips with long black tongue and slipped its fingers under the window sash, slowly sliding it upward. No! She screamed. She dove toward the window, slammed it down, and snapped the lock in place. The creature outside hissed at her wildly, showing its jagged fangs. Amanda! Her father bellowed. The room was suddenly flooded with light. What's going on? That thing! Dad, that thing! Amanda cried, pointing to the beast, pressing its gruesome face against the panes. Daddy, what is it? It tried to get inside my room. What is it? What is what? Her father said, looking around Amanda's room, bewildered. That! Don't you see it? It's right there. Her mom rushed to her side, tried to console her. There's nothing there, honey. It's okay. I just had a nightmare. No, listen to me. How can you possibly not see it? The creature scraped its talons across the glass. She's burning up with fever, Amanda's mom declared. And this rash is worse. We've got to get her to the hospital. Within moments, her mother had her bundle in a robe, and her dad carried her to the car. You're going to be all right, baby, he assured her as he tucked her gently into the back seat. Amanda could barely hear him. Her mind was riveted on the image of this scaled creature she'd seen just outside her window. The emergency room was stunningly bright. Dozens of people crowded in the waiting areas. Nurses in clean white uniforms listened to frantic complaints and directed one patient after another to see the doctors. It was just like Amanda had seen on television, but she never suspected that she would be in such a place herself. But there was more, much more, which Amanda now realized she alone could see. Some people have all the luck, don't they? Slinking in the corners and loping down the long, polished walls were scores of horrible creatures, much like the one she had seen at her own window. Most were small. They clung to the injured bodies of patients, poking and lapping at their wounds. One scarlet-red beast wrapped its greasy-looking talons around a man's obviously broken arm and squeezed. The man cried out in pain. Please come this way, a young nurse said, ushering Amanda and her parents toward an available room. As the girl walked nervously past them, each creature stopped and glared at her. Yes, she muttered, I can see you. You can't hurt me because I can see you. Her parents looked at each other worriedly. I'd like to keep her overnight for observation, the worried doctor announced to Amanda's mom and dad after examining Amanda. Appears to be some kind of bacterial infection, and antibiotics should take care of that, and I've given her something to calm her and help her rest, but with her fever so high, she'll be better off staying here for the night, all right? Amanda was suddenly very groggy. She barely heard her mother say that she would stay with her for the night. The next thing she knew, she was awake, still groggy, in a starchy, cleaned hospital bed. She wasn't alone. In the light of the gray dawn, she saw her mother sleeping soundly in a chair near the window. On her left, there was an empty bed. A teenage girl tossed restlessly in the bed on her right. Slowly, almost soundlessly, the door to the room opened. Amanda saw a shadow stretch across the foot of all three beds. Terrified, she turned her head ever so slightly, knowing all the while what she would see. A creature, larger, more hideous than any of the others she had seen, loomed in the doorway. It, too, was covered in scales, where they were as black as night. Its large snake-like eyes glowed silver, and it gnashed its ivory teeth as it moved deliberately into the room. The thing seemed to drag its feet as it progressed. The air took on a dank, musty odor, and Amanda tried to press her face into the pillows. The creature halted and focused its gaze on her and sniffed the air. I've got to run, Amanda thought. It doesn't know I can see it. I can get away before it gets any closer. Then she remembered her mother sleeping helplessly only a few feet away. If she ran, the thing might hurt her. The beast lumbered to Amanda's side. Paralyzed with fright, she could smell the thing's horrible, fetid breath A warm, gooey drop of drool fell on her neck as the creature rested a razor-sharp talon on her throat. Now! Her brain screamed. Do something, now! Just at that moment, the girl in the bed next to her whimpered slightly, and the beast shifted its attention. In one sudden movement, it turned around and grabbed the teenager by the neck, digging its claws in deeply. The girl struggled for breath. Amanda rolled off her bed and screamed as loud as she could. Help! It's going to kill her! Somebody help us! The door slammed open and a nurse rushed in, followed by another nurse and doctor. The three raced to the bedside of the teenager, and the doctor barked orders. They obviously did not see the hideous creature still hunched over the dying girl. Amanda huddled in the corner, cradled in her mother's arms. The doctor pulled the bed curtain, hiding the stricken patient from view. Why can't they see it? Amanda sobbed. All at once the room became very still. The only sound was the steady, high-pitched tones from a monitor of the girl's bed. She's gone, the doctor announced softly. One of the nurses slipped from behind the curtain. I think it's best if we take you to another room, she said gently. Amanda allowed herself to be led away, and she didn't protest when the doctor gave her a shot. Her thoughts drifted back to the old woman on the bus. She had been able to sense them, too. Or was it... What was it she had said? It was something about the sickness being her salvation. Because she could see the creatures, she could protect herself from them. Amanda turned her half-little eyes to her mother. The old woman had given her a gift after all. Now that she knew the creatures were there, she realized it would be more horrifying if she couldn't see them, if she were helpless and blind to their attacks. How do you feel, baby? Amanda's dad whispered to her. She opened her eyes slowly and blinked in the bright sunlight pouring in through the hospital window. Her parents stood together beside her bed, smiling down at her. You gave us quite a scare, young lady, her mom said, but everything's going to be all right now. Better than ever, someone added. Amanda turned to see the doctor standing in the doorway. We still can't be sure what caused the infection, but our latest test showed no sign of it. Your fever's gone. I'm sure you'll be glad to hear you can go home. I don't think you'd be bothered anymore by those awful... He paused as if he was searching for the right word. Nightmares. What? Amanda cried. She sat up straight and raised her arms to the light. There was no rash. Throwing the bedding aside, she dashed to the door. In the corridor, she saw patients, harried nurses, orderlies, visitors. But the creatures were gone. No, she moaned as a chill ran through her body, and she realized the gift the old woman had given her had somehow worn off. They're here. I know they're here. Everywhere. Her hands trembled, and she choked back tears. They're going to come for me. They're going to come for me, and I won't know where or when. Gravelings. So, any other fans of Dead Like Me and Georgia Lass and Ruben and the whole gang? One of my favorite shows anyway. Hey, look, we have time for another story. And you're still here. And more of you joined us. Hello, Aquarius. Hello, Serene. And Cruz. And Unda. Wow. And I think I said hi to Zaphod earlier. Remember, we are going to have a late night horror. When this is over at 9 o'clock, we'll have another horror story. But right now. Yes, as in her big eye. Yes, as in her big eyes. That's the one. What was her little sister's name? Her little sister was great. I can't remember now. It'll come back to me. Anyway, food and lodging. The clanking noise grew louder under the hood. Then one of my very favorite parts of that show is the very first part where Georgia looks up at the sky, the toilet flying down from the space station before it smacks her in the head and kills her and says, ah, shit. That's just the way I'd like to go out, not necessarily by a toilet from a space station, but with calm resolve and resignation. Crap. Anyway, probably have to cut that from the YouTube. Food and lodging. The clanking grew... Let's try that again. Food and lodging. Take 3. The clanking noise grew louder under the hood, and then the engine let out a final gurgling gasp and quit. Now what? Mr. Williams groaned. He guided the yelling car to the side of the 2-lane highway and coasted to a stop. Maybe it's something simple, Mrs. Williams offered hopefully. Yeah, you all stay in here, okay? Mr. Williams said sternly, opening the driver's door. I'll check it out. Jonathan watched from the back seat as his father moved to the front of the car and popped the hood open. A very light drizzle dotted the windshield with a haze of tiny droplets. What's going on? In the back seat, Ian, Jonathan's younger brother, stirred to life. He had nodded off somewhere after they'd crossed the state line into Georgia. Not last, the state. Something's the matter with the car, Jonathan answered. We might be stuck here forever in the wilderness. Ooh. He tried to sound creepy. He enjoyed teasing his brother. Jonathan's mother gave him a stern look. Don't start that nonsense, John. Your father will get it fixed and we'll be on our way to Florida in no time. Jonathan grimaced, unsure of what was worse, getting stuck on some backwoods highway or enduring 3 days of fun at his mom's family reunion. The hood slammed shut, grim-faced. Mr. Williams slid back into the driver's seat. Well, we aren't going anywhere now, he announced, dropping both hands on the wheel and slouching forward. It's a fan belt. It's broken. Jonathan's mom frowned. How far are we from the nearest town? Probably 10 miles, Mr. Williams replied, glancing at the road map as he kept on the dash. Should we try to walk? Jonathan questioned. His dad shook his head. I don't think that'd be smart. I'm not really sure how far we have to go. Besides, it'll be dark in a couple hours. He glanced up and down the road. Probably safer if we stay in the car. Someone's bound to come along before long. Ian looked worriedly at his parents. You mean we're stuck out here? For the time being, it looks that way, son, his father answered. Jonathan rolled his window down slightly and peered out. Dense undergrowth and tall trees draped with Spanish moss lined both sides of the highway. Here and there, pools of still, swampy water silently lured mosquitoes and flying foxes and dragonflies. As the family sat quietly, each person lost in his or her own thoughts, Jonathan could hear the insistent buzzing and clicking of insects and the rumble of approaching thunder. Do you think there are snakes out there? Ian asked. Probably, Jonathan whispered. And bears, and giant spiders, and maybe even the lizard man. He'd read something about the legend of a creature, half man, half lizard, that supposedly stalked the back roads in the southeast, and even though he didn't believe this story, he rarely missed an opportunity to frighten his brother. Oh, what lizard man? Ian murmured. Jonathan curled his fingers in the claws and leaned toward his little brother. It's this disgusting, scaly thing that drags tourists into the swamps and rips them limb from... Jonathan! His mother yelled. You're going to scare him half to death. She turned in her seat to soothe Ian. Honey, he's just making it up. There's no such thing as a lizard man. Isn't that right, Paul? She said, turning to Jonathan's father for support. Somebody's coming, he answered, gazing up the rearview mirror. Jonathan felt his heart skip a beat. He turned and looked out the back window, half expecting to see some hideous creature loping toward them. Instead, he saw a battered tow truck roll up behind the car. A tall, gangly man dressed in overalls, work boots, and a wide-brimmed hat stepped out from the cab. Gravel crunched under his boots as he walked forward toward their car. Yeah, you folks need some help? The man asked, leaning down into the driver's side window. He had a long nose and pale, watery eyes. Jonathan didn't like the way the man squinted at them, looking them over one at a time. Yeah, we're stuck here, Mr. Williams answered plaintively. Fan belt, can you give us a tow into town? Yeah, sure thing. The man said in a thick southern accent. Name's Wendell Graves. I'll hook you up, take you back into Clayton. It's just a mile up that road. He pointed to a wide dirt path that seemed to lead into the swamp. Clayton, Mr. Williams said uncertainly. I didn't see it on the map. Wendell Graves smiled. The expression made him look slightly insane. He rubbed his chin with his gloved hand. Clayton's a small town. We get overlooked most of the time. Most of us don't mind it that way. My shop's up there. I could take a look at your car, and I'll fix it up in no time. Eh? Okay, sounds good, Mr. Williams said cheerfully. The ride into Clayton was surprisingly short, as Mr. Graves had said. It was a very small town, with just one main road and a few houses set far back among the trees. Jonathan surveyed each building as the tow truck crept to the end of the deserted street. They looked as if they could use a coat of paint, and the shades were securely drawn across every window. Once the group had reached the ramshackle garage, Mr. Graves examined the engine of the car and set off in the storeroom to find a new fan belt. Where is everybody? Jonathan's mom asked no one in particular. This place gives me the creeps. The family stood in a solemn line several feet behind the open garage door, protected from the rain that now lashed the pavement and began to form small puddles. As darkness slowly settled over the town, Jonathan had an eerie sensation they were being watched. There's a diner over there, Mom, Ian said, pointing across the street. I haven't eaten anything since this morning. Yeah, me either, Ian. Can we go get a hamburger or something? I'm sorry, honey. I noticed a close sign in the window. We'll get something once we're back on the road. Yeah. Apologies, ma'am, but it looks like you won't be going anywhere tonight. Jonathan saw his mom flinch when the man spoke. I don't have the part you need. With the rain coming on, I don't have any notion to go fetch it now, neither. But I'll drive up to Taylor first thing tomorrow morning. Maybe, meanwhile, you can put up over at the boarding house there. He gestured toward a 2-story building across the street next to the diner. I didn't think it was open, Jonathan's dad remarked. It is now. Graves said matter-of-factly. Strange looked passed over the man's face, one that made Jonathan's flesh crawl. Huh, so it is, Mrs. Williams said in surprise. Following his dad's gaze, Jonathan saw the shades were indeed open and the light glowed in the ground floor window. A young woman was standing in the doorway, staring in their direction. This is so weird, Jonathan whispered to his mom as his family hurried across the muddy street. Do we have to stay here? Well, we don't seem to have a choice, hon, she answered, sounding as uneasy as he felt. When the family reached the doorway, the woman signaled them to come inside. Jonathan noticed a little boy standing behind her just inside the doorway of the boarding house. Good night, Allie. Stick to the map, right? That's what I'd say, too. Welcome, she said a little too eagerly. My name is Sarah. Let me take you to your rooms. Wendell will bring your bags over. Like Mr. Graves, there seemed to be something odd about her smile. Thank you, Jonathan's mom replied politely. We're a little worn out. We could use a bite to eat. Will the diner be opening soon? No, I'm sorry. The diner hasn't been open in quite some time. Once inside, Jonathan looked around furtively. The little boy he had seen earlier had disappeared. He turned back around and glanced down in the darkening street, startled to see that there was now several people standing in the shadows across the road, and others walking slowly toward the boarding house. A few minutes ago, the town had seemed deserted. Good night, Savage. Oh, no, Savage saying good night to Allie. Sorry, I thought the I was an exclamation point. Good night, Allie. Hello, Savage. A few minutes ago, the town had seemed deserted. Come along, Sarah coaxed. Don't get left behind. She placed a pale hand on Jonathan's arm. Her fingers were like ice, and Jonathan felt a shiver course through his body. She showed the family to 2 adjoining rooms on the second floor that were clean but very old-fashioned. Please let me know if there's anything else I can do. Her eyes glittered as she spoke. We want you to feel right at home, she said before closing the door. I'm hungry, Mom, Ian complained. There's something strange going on here, Jonathan's mom said to his dad. I didn't see a grocery store or market as we came in. Where do these people shop? I don't know, he answered, kicking off his boots. Right now I could do with a rest. He turned towards Jonathan and Ian. Well, we can all get some sleep, and tomorrow we'll find a place to get pancakes. Before long, both boys were tucked into bed in the next room to their parents. Sleep tight, guys. Well, Jonathan's mom whispered as he snapped off the light and then hesitated. It's a little stuffy in here. Would you like me to open the window before I go? Don't open the window. Stick to the map and don't open the window. Jeez. Yeah, thanks, Mom, Jonathan answered, yawning. Even on an empty stomach, he had no trouble falling into a deep sleep, and he probably could have slept a good 10 hours if it were not for the strange gurgling sound that woke him. At first he thought it came from outside, and then he realized it was much closer. He sat up slowly. The window was wide open. There was a slight break in the clouds, and just for a moment moonlight streamed across the floor and spread over the foot of his bed. Are you awake, Ian? He mumbled groggily. His senses quickly sharpened to crystal clarity when he noticed there was something else in the room, leaning over Ian's bed. The clouds once again shut out the moon, and the room slipped back into darkness, and Jonathan lunged for the bedside lamp and snapped it on. Bright light flooded the room, and he felt as if his heart might leap right out of his chest. There, leaning over his pallid, seemingly lifeless brother, was the little boy he had seen earlier. The child whirled to glare at Jonathan, bearing two long, sharp fangs tipped with dark blood. His mind reeling in horror, Jonathan gawked at the two red puncture wounds in his brother's neck. With a ghastly hiss, the little boy raced to the window and leaped out. For a moment, Jonathan sat in stunned silence, petrified by his own fear, until a scream ripped from his throat. He bounded from his bed and raced to his parents' room. Throwing open the door, he found their beds empty. "Mom! Dad!" he screamed and ran into the hall, down the stairs to the lobby, where Sarah was waiting for him. "Jonathan, dear boy, we were waiting and expecting you," she cooed, smiling evilly, no longer trying to cover the ivory fangs that peeked out from under her upper lip. Several other townspeople stood near the door. They all shared the same hideous trait: pale skin, red-rimmed eyes, slender, talon-tipped fingers. Trembling from head to toe, Jonathan gripped the handrail to keep himself from collapsing in a heap. "Vampires," he whimpered. "Come on, boy," a familiar voice called to him. "Just get it over with." Mr. Graves stepped out from the shadows and beckoned. "You!" Jonathan rasped, his mouth dry and raw. "But we saw you in the daylight. You can't be one of them." Something resembling a laugh came from Mr. Graves' throat. "Maybe not completely. Not yet. I can still take the sun for a little while." He reached up and pulled a handkerchief from his neck, revealing several pairs of scarred-up wounds. "But it won't be long now until I'm truly one of them, in every way." With his fear fueling him, Jonathan turned and bolted back up the stairs into his room. Ian's bed was empty. Jonathan dashed to the window and crawled out onto the roof. The limb of a large tree reached out to him. Ignoring the branches that scratched at his face and hands, Jonathan worked his way down as far as he could, then jumped. He hit the ground and rolled. A fiery pain shot up his left leg, but he couldn't stop now. The vampires had already seen him, and they were moving in to cut off his escape. "No, you don't, boy," Mr. Graves shouted, leaping from the shadows and clutching at Jonathan's arm. "Get away!" Jonathan howled. He twisted out of the man's grip and fled down the street as the others fell behind. Rain pelted the ground and the darkened windows of the vacant buildings lining the crumbling sidewalk. Jonathan had no idea where he was going. He only knew that he had to get away. Suddenly a car sped toward him from the darkness. The driver slammed on the brakes and the car skidded to a halt in front of him in a cloud of flying mud and pebbles. One of the back doors flew open and his mom's voice rang. "Get in!" she yelled. He could see his dad hunched over the wheel. Jonathan jumped in, slammed the door behind him, and curled up in a ball as the car moved on. "Ian, I couldn't save him." "Don't worry, dear," his mother said calmly. "You will." "You will." Something about her tone made Jonathan quiver. He gazed up at her smiling face. Her tiny, newly formed fangs glittered in the moonlight. The car stopped as his parents got out. His own door opened. Slowly he looked up to see his little brother. "I'm hungry, Jonathan," Ian rasped, his red-rimmed eyes fixed on Jonathan's throat. So, and that's the wrap of our scary stories for stormy nights.